Lovely. Okay, let's start. So hello and welcome to the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, London and South East regions, that's such a mouthful, First Thursday events. I'm Julia Ellis, I chair the committee, and as ever, I would like to say a big thank you to the volunteers who've given up their time to deliver today's event. We've got Mike on tech, Stephen on Q&A, and we're all dedicated to promoting excellence in fundraising. We're always looking for volunteers to join our committee. So if you fancy joining our lovely, happy team, then do get in touch with me. My name is Julia Ellis, as I say, via LinkedIn. So just a few bits of housekeeping. We do record these events, so please do anonymise yourself if you wish to do so. And everyone will be on mute, but if you've got any questions, then please do pop them into the Q&A and not the chat function, because we might miss them, and we'll endeavour to answer as many as we can at the end. But if there are any issues, however, then please do pop those in the chat function so we can sort it out, and do tell us, of course, where you're from and say hello. So it'd be fantastic if you could please tweet about the event and tag us at CIOF London SE and our speaker at Urban MBA. I can't remember what's that underscore hyphen. So help me out here, Kofi.
Yeah, it's Urban MBA underscore.
All right, thank you. Sorry, I should check that.
For Instagram and Twitter, it's Urban underscore MBA.
Right, fabulous. Thank you. Okay, last bit from me. So anybody who's not yet a member of the Chartered Institute, then because you've come along today, then I can offer you a discount code, which is LDN/group, LDN/group, which will give you a whopping £49 off your first annual membership, and that will give you discounted rates of future events, including convention, training courses and qualifications, plus a ton of other benefits. So enough from me. I'm now delighted to hand you over to our fabulous guest speaker, Kofi Opong.
So thank you for having me. My name is Kofi Opong, and I am the founder of the charity Urban MBA. We are known as the University for Street Entrepreneurs, our strapline, and both the first name, Urban MBA, is designed to talk to funders and anybody else outside of the social industry. And the University for Street Entrepreneurs is usually how our younger people find us. And that can be quite important for you to understand from a target market perspective. So I'm just going to give you a bit of my background and history. Hip hop was what I grew up on and got me into a little bit of trouble when I was younger. I have first generation African Ghanaian parents, and while hip hop was the big thing, and it will be a running theme throughout this presentation, I decided to go to a concert where these two people were going to be at in 1989. And because of the fact that it was the big trend for young people at the time, I had to go because the concert was in Brixton Academy. But my Ghanaian dad said I was not allowed to go because we were arguing about the future of what I was supposed to do, as I didn't want to go to higher education. So on the left is Big Daddy Kane, and on the right is Salt and Pepper, for anybody who's not aware of who they are. I went to the concert and I came back and my dad had locked me out the house. I ended up sleeping in the local park bench. And then what happened from there is I got back home at 6 a.m. knowing that usually my younger brother would be up, and what he does is he would let me in either through the back door or from the front. On this occasion, though, I got to the front door and my dad had left 2 black bin liners of clothes, telling me that he didn't want me in the house. And then I left home at 17 because of that incident. I'm sports mad, and despite all the issues that I was having, I was still a bit going to football on a Sunday. And part of that was I always wanted a JD Sports string bag, and I used to go up to JD in Oxford Street all the time to get one. And at the same time, I started reading all things around sneakers, as there was a big trend with Nike Air, Reebok Pump, LA Gear, all those things that anybody who's young enough can remember. This is the car that I slept in for 2 or 3 nights after I got kicked out of home. And as I said, I then started still playing football and going to JD. That ended up with me reading the sneakers, ended up getting a job at JD Sports, and I ended up being one of the managers for the stores. And then in 1998, I joined Nike and I opened Nike Town. So below are 2 pictures of some of my personal heroes, Nas and Arsene Wenger, who is probably the most intelligent man I've ever met. I left Nike in 2008, and one of the reasons was because I was homeless. I felt that I'd been lucky. What also happened was that most of my learning came from reading books such as Think and Grow Rich, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, etc. And I realized the world wasn't quite what it was supposed to be. I also learned a very valuable lesson about goal setting after school and through my sporting career. Goal setting was a big thing. It's become a big part of what we do at Urban MBA. And I felt that had I learned that stuff in school, I would have been further ahead. Knowing this, I felt that being lucky and didn't get into any trouble, too much trouble when I was younger, despite my circumstances, I left and went on to create a social enterprise that I worked at for 3 or 4 years before I created Urban MBA. So Urban MBA's vision and mission is to create a world where no young person is lost or left behind, and that is in relation to the education piece that I just mentioned. Our mission is to reach out to these young adults who do not have required experience and knowledge and help them transform into successful entrepreneurs. We are what's described as education disruptors, and the company was a CIO, sorry, the charity was inaugurated in 2016 as a CIO, which is a charitable incorporated organization, and it's what's described as a modern charity, a bit more commercial. And as education disruptors, one of the things that we are bringing back is faster courses that are much more vocational, a bit like the Polytechnic. So we've just finished a Leveling Up course, which is a 1-year course designed to be free, higher education, and it's at level 6, which is university level 1. And that pilot has just been completed last year, and we plan to roll this out to offer more free education to those who cannot access the higher education because of the cost of what an MBA would normally cost, anything from 50,000 upwards. And it means that there's a big group of people that won't get higher education. The other issue is that STEM and those things are too far behind. Our big mission is that we work around 9 transformative technologies that we believe are going to change the future, such as AI, which right now is the big trend. But there are other technologies coming, such as quantum computers next year. We've got autonomous cars. All of these things are going to make our lives very, very different. And there's a prediction of nearly 300 million jobs being lost in the future due to AI. And while many people are talking about the fact that whenever these things happen, there are other jobs that are created. In the past, we've never had robots who are capable of taking a lot of the human jobs that are currently there. And the gap will widen even more between rich and poor, because the basic jobs such as cleaners are about to be replaced by robotic machines that can do these jobs for them. So it's very important that we educate the next generation and upskill previous generations to be able to take advantage of what's about to come. So what we do is we do 12 weeks enterprise courses, 6 weeks enterprise courses, 1-day workshops, and as I mentioned to you, the Leveling Up. We also have an online course that also teaches business in very similar formats to what we do. So one of the big issues is that young people at the moment, or all people, are being rewired because of social media. So it's what's called, McKinsey did a report on it maybe 8 years ago, and it's what's called a 4-8-second filter. You all know that you will probably be watching TV, be on your phones and doing lots of different things at the same time. And it just means that younger people, or people in general, have shorter attention spans. So it's important that it's very visual. And so what we use is blended learning style as a big part of our education, as well as storytelling, because the problem with education is it's too memory based. So stories are part of what we do. It's a story first, and then we then give them the information that's required for them to be able to start up a business. They get given life skills within it, vocational skills, and we are looking for 3 things: goal setting, confidence, and presentation, and presenting. And we can tell if they have gained confidence, because everybody has to develop a business idea at the end of the course and present it. And as most of you know, the only thing that people fear worse than death is presenting. So it's a good barometer to see how they've developed through the course. As I said, they get level 3 and 6 and unlimited mentoring. So we believe setting clear goals, business cycles, and problem solving leads to entrepreneurship. But the big issue that we're here to discuss is really about funding, in particular for marginalized communities. So it was a big part of my thinking when I first started the charity to make it a charity, because I knew the problems with all the reading that marginalized communities face with getting finance. And that's why I chose to be a charity, because charities can have access to 100% of funding and grants that are available. And it then works out, if you're CIC, it's about 70 or 80%. And then social enterprises is about 40 to 60% of most funding that you can apply for. And the reason is because of the governance. So it's really important to, before you even start, think about how you're going to approach these things. And my thinking was this way, and that's why we set up as a charity. We do have a limited company next to it, which the charity owns 30%, and the limited company does the commercial activities and passes some of the money back to the CIO. We're also in Ghana and Africa, where we're teaching enterprise and business, as that is the biggest prediction now of the future, that most of the new business is going to come either through EMEA, which is East Midland Africa, and also from India. So I mentioned the model to you. We, as a Black community in particular, and marginalized community, are overrepresented in prisons, underrepresented in higher education. We have more chance of mental health because of some of the issues that we face in not being able to access things like finance, and actually lots of the services that are created don't support many of the things in those communities. Whereas we also have no representation of Black role models in schools, and there is a whole challenge that at 13, lots of Black men go off the radar because of the fact that they don't have role models. But up to about 8 or 9, most of them are doing very well in school, and these problems start occurring a bit later on. At 16 is also the next time where there's a big divide within education. In the fact that 16-year-olds are then told by their careers teachers that they're not going to go anywhere, and generally don't access higher education for that particular reason. So a lot of what we do is around those areas. When it comes to funding, once you have set up your company and everything else, there are, and I've just put 4 there, there are obviously many more: government funding, startup funding, venture capitalist, capital investment funding, and one of the things, crowdfunding, which is your Kickstarters and all those areas of the world in terms of trying to gain some money into your business for you to operate. And so what we'll do is we'll start by looking at a wider picture of what's actually going on, because there is a lot of change in the world at the moment. And in particular, from a finance and monetary perspective, when you look at it globally, it gives you an idea of what's actually happening when we bring it back down to local. So the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are starting to create their own currencies because of the dominance of the dollar. And as a person from Africa, seeing what the Fed Reserves, the International Monetary Fund, do when they give these countries money, is they tend to not be able to get out of the debt, which cripples them, and they cannot do or get out or use their resources well enough in order to get out of these debts. So it's important to look at this, because as we go forward, funding might change, and we might be getting funded in crypto and all of those types of currencies. So a thing to look at is that money is changing in the same way banks are changing, and we've seen a new batch of banks such as Monzo and Starlight because of the fact that technology is now running what we're doing. And this is why you need to have a sort of global understanding of some of the things that are happening. But when we talk about venture capitalists, and one of the things here to look at is that only 1% of funding globally is ever given to minorities, communities, and women and Black funders, as an example. And this has been happening now for a long time. So I think that people don't want to solve it. Because we already know this exists, and some of the problems that we have are because of the way these things are looked at in terms of how people perceive Black organizations and whether they should be funding them. So just some stats to go around that. The venture capitalists, as an example, that give only 1%. It says, and some quick things from this, that capitalists are destroying value by overlooking founders from swaths of the population, including women, people of color, and those from other disfavored regional or class backgrounds. despite study after study demonstrating that this pattern of bias has led to profoundly negative economic consequences, and that the founders and investors who come from outside the VC bubble reliably and sustainably outperform insiders, gives you an example that they are deliberately, or there is some problem in how money is then distributed to marginalized communities. It's $1 trillion industry, and actually this was one of the reports recently where Morgan Stanley looked at this situation, and what they came up to conclusion-wise is that venture capitalists and all of those guys that give out funding are not aware that they are underfunding marginalized communities, which I don't really understand. I think it's quite common knowledge now, but that was the report that came through from them when you look at it from a bigger perspective. The average funding amount is usually around 1 million for other communities that aren't marginalized. And if you compare that to marginalized communities in terms of what they get average funded on, it's about $213,000. So that's a difference of about $750,000 per person in terms of funding that's given out to minority-owned businesses. So what are some of the issues as we bring it down to local? Here are some things that I see and is being talked about. So Black entrepreneurs in the UK face significant disparities in accessing funding. A study by the British Business Bank found that Black-owned businesses receive disproportionately lower levels of funding compared to business owned by their white counterparts. And we've seen that when I talk about it from a global perspective, the same thing happens as we get down to local. Loan approval rates are very different, and according to the Treasury Committee, Black entrepreneurs are more likely to have their loan applications rejected compared to white counterparts. Third one is factors such as lower personal wealth, limited networks, and historical barriers contribute to this challenge of Black entrepreneurs finding funding. So the bias and discrimination, Runnymede Trust, which many of you might have heard of, do really great reports on many subjects. And they've also said that racial biases in financial institutions leading to disparities in lending and funding opportunities for Black entrepreneurs. And I think even with the AI world that is currently raging, those people that are writing the codes and the programs tend to also write in their unconscious bias. So if in the future, computers are the ones that are giving us the decisions, which sort of they are at the moment, it won't change because those racial biases will be put into programs in the same way that people think. So we've got to look at that as well from a funding perspective. And one that really blights our community, and the one that I struggle with some of our entrepreneurs, is the networking and opportunities. We talked earlier on about a vocational course for 1 year, given access to higher education. One of the things that we have to do a lot in that is talk about networking to the Black communities, and that they need to get out there more and do networking. What we found out with that course is that many university students, as you know, 90% of them don't go into the studies that they trained for. What tends to happen is that they get from universities the networking opportunities, which is what they value the most. This chance is not given to marginalized communities as they're growing up. And so they have a very poor understanding of what networking means and even how to do it, because they feel they're being judged. And in terms of financial education and support, Black entrepreneurs may also face challenges related to financial literacy and access to business support services in the UK. Limited knowledge of financial management and lack of support in preparing funding applications can impact their ability to secure funding. So what are some of those solutions? This year and every year, there tends to be a theme that councils are using, or it's the big buzzword. And we've been talking a lot about equity. And I've mentioned to you that globally at the moment, it's the same thing with 1% ever getting funding from that. The problems are that we need to think of it in an equity way, i.e. what do we need to create around Black founders for them to be able to access funding opportunities. And I'm going to give you an example of what happened to me with a funder that I think explains what I'm talking about really well. So I mentioned hip hop was a running theme, and it was very interesting that that hip hop was the key thing for me growing up, and that I grew up through the Rodney King incident way back in 1993, which 30 years later I saw exactly the same thing again with George Floyd in terms of the Black Lives Matter and what happened after that. What happens is that businesses generally have a 3, 5, or 7-year cycle. And what you've got to do within the first 3 years is learn what you are doing within your business area. And what you'll find is that most businesses that survive of the, which is 10%, because 90% go bust in the first 3 years, you will end up changing what you do. And around 3 years, there's usually a pivot model because of your understanding of the industry. If you survive long enough to get to that period there. 5 years tends to be the period where most organizations break even because they understand what's going on. And then 7 years is usually between 5, 7 and above is when you start realizing profit. So why am I talking about that with these 2 slides? Well, what happened with the Black Lives Matter was opportunities came about. And from my perspective, I was struggling to always get funding for what we do, despite the numerous amount of case studies that we have that what we do is right. An opportunity came about from that, where we're now looking at what I've talked about in terms of equity, that all of a sudden people were looking at how money was given to Black organizations and recognize that they weren't the best people to be doing that. So what's happened is there's been a raft of funding that's been made available for marginalized communities, like what I'm showing to you here. And this is what I have concentrated on as the opportunity in order to gain more funding in. I was given our biggest funding opportunity by Pathways to Economic Opportunities program, which was specifically ran for Black entrepreneurs. And I don't think without the George Floyd incident happening and Black Lives Matter and a deeper dive into organizations looking at their diversity and inclusion, these funds would have come about. But there's now a general understanding that because funding is not getting to marginalized communities, that they need to find bigger Black organizations that can distribute this funding to the marginalized communities. And I said I would share a story with you after an incident that happened with me. So I was working with a funder and we were trying to get social investment. This was around 4 or 5 years ago. And that funder was actually doing a case study on why up to £5,000, many marginalized communities would apply for funding in that area. After £5,000 and going up to 15K, which was the biggest grant that they gave, it worked down to 5 or 10%. So they were doing an impact study to see why that was happening. I applied for a grant from them and I was told that we would be getting something. And we did a lot of work for 6 months, only to be told that our finance area was not up to scratch and we couldn't get the money. Now, interestingly enough, they could have told me that right at the beginning. They're also doing a study on these problems in terms of funding. So could they not have taken a risk on me as an example, because I'd shown success with the first grant that they'd given me already, which is why they were even considering me for social investment. And there is a problem within our community that what happens with marginalized communities is they feel they're not worthy enough to apply for bigger funding. So they tend to be chasing all the small funding, which is up to 5K, etc. And anything bigger than that, they tend to be eliminated from. And as my mentor first told me, applying for 5K is no different to applying for 100,000. So you should be doing that and not looking for the minor amounts of money. Now, they're looking for the minor amounts of money because of the fact that a lot of Black founders tend to want to do the doing a lot. So they're out there in the community. And I know this because I work with organizations such as the Hackney Social Founders Group. And when you listen to social founders, they are just concerned with getting the job done, i.e. what they're there for and their impact. And so they have a real big problem with understanding the other areas and what they need to do to be able to access bigger pots of funding. So what can the community do better? As I've just mentioned, spend as much time on operations and as you are doing maybe what your mission and vision is, or find someone who can. There are many organizations that can help. I IP'd all our training program, etc., because I found out about Trust Law, who provide pro bono for these communities. So when it talked earlier on about networks and stuff, there are ways out there that you can find some of the stuff that you need to get it done, but it's how you access that information. The other problem with Black communities in particular is they go for all of the same grants all the time. Now, if you go for all the same big ones, and you tend to then not be able to get the funding, because a lot of funding is usually allocated, in my experience, out before the bids even go in. The other, and only a small proportion, is kept for whoever writes the grant. So widen the grant search. What we did is found another organization that could write bids for me, because I was getting tired of all the 24 hours I was doing deadlines and pulling my hair out and trying to run funding bids. And what happens is we get too emotional as founders when we write funding bids. So we tend to put our heart and soul into it and tend to forget about all the criteria around the funding bid. And that is the most important aspect to understand. And so taking it out of my hands was the thing that I wanted to do. And we've been much more successful since we did that. So find organizations that can help you do that. And then the other thing is to know your worth. As I mentioned, only 5K, up to 5K, you get all the communities applying for. Anything above that, they tend not to. And I think they don't know their worth, or they think they'll be turned down so often that they tend to go for the smaller pots, which is completely the opposite of what you should be doing. So in order to prepare yourself for funding, one of the things to do is be very clear in your vision and mission. And I've met many organizations or social organizations who have a vision and mission, but they're not clear about it. And in the first 3 years, as I mentioned, this area, you need to navigate very quickly and understand what you're trying to do, and be clear on where you're trying to go, because that will then help you decide what funding bids you can go for, because there's always a criteria around them. A great example is that lived experience is now a big thing that council members are asking for. When I used to talk about lived experience 6 or 7 years ago, it wasn't the done thing, but we're starting to recognize that those people with lived experience are actually great at solving the problems. So when you are looking at your organization and thinking about funding, this area needs to be crystal clear in terms of what you do. And then you can then look at the funding bids around what you do and then apply for it in that way. We also find that 30 or 40% of bids are bids that are going in that don't suit the criteria of the funding organization. And that's why most people get turned down. So if they say they are looking for educational stuff between 16 and 18 that will help them to employability, and your job is that, and that's your target age group, then that's the funding that you need to go for. The other thing is your trustees, etc. One of the big areas of charities and funding applications is to make sure that you've got your organization set up with the right founders and the trustees, because they technically run your organization. So if you don't have this part of your operation sorted out, and I can say it sounds very commonplace, but I've just had a person that we're mentoring, and I spoke to them about making sure that on the Charities Commission, they had the information of their trustees. They forgot to do it, and so they got turned down for the application that they were doing. A lot of these organizations will go and check the back end of what you are doing, who's running your organizations, and look at all of those things before they decide what they do. And if you're not operationally set up correctly, it will go against you. Here's an example of what that looks like in the Charities Commission, showing the trustees and all of those. So this operational side of you need to make sure you have right. If you're a limited company, obviously this does not apply, but you still do need to have a great business plan, a great idea of your vision and mission, and where all of those areas go to. So I mentioned earlier on about not being turned down by a particular charity, a funder that I was working with. And here's an example about when we didn't have it. correct from an operational standpoint. As you can see here, these are our annual reports that we uploaded to the Charities Commission. Now, when I first set up Urban MBA, we didn't have much money. So I found an organization that was going to do our accounts for us and paid them, and they did it. And I was happy. It was late, as you can see, the first one was late, and but we did manage to get it in. Now, what happened is when I went for funding, these two annual reports that you see there that were late was one of the key reasons why they didn't want to give me the social investment. And what I then found out, what I delved into, what they were looking at is the accountants that we had that filed our accounts for us did not need to on the first year file detailed accounts. So they just did a general one, which then impacted me applying for funding, which I didn't realize. So the second reason why you see the accounts were late is because I then had to reverse engineer, go back and look at what they had done and get another accountancy firm to then put it correct. And that then delayed our second accounts for those reasons. But what we did well was we called up the Charities Commission and told them, but it then made those two accounts late and looked not favorable for our organization. And I know this is a big part, because even now when we do grants, some organizations come back to us from the funding committee and say, why were your first two accounts so late? And we have to go through this explanation time and time again of telling them how we had to re-engineer and go back, which they're satisfied for. I then learned my lesson very, very quickly. And as you can see, since then, we've had all our accounts in on time. Now, what I did was, knowing that I'm a trainer, I've got a corporate background. So I had a young person come in who wanted to learn accounts, which I sent him out to get training elsewhere, etc. And since that period, and since he's been in charge, we have had our accounts in on time, because I know how important it is for when you go and apply for funding. So just to summarize what we are talking about, there is more funding available now just for marginalized communities, and it's worthwhile thinking about looking for those funds to see if they are better for you now that this opportunity has opened up from that area. Having all your operational stuff in order will help you also be better qualified to gain funding. And the other thing is that think about bigger funds. What do you actually need? Once you've proven your pilot for what you do, which was what usually happens in year one, you can then start applying for the funding that would help you to move to the next stage. Lots of people use the lottery, which have a 10K grant and are quite open to giving funding for organizations right at the beginning. And that's what you've got to navigate. Some funds are easier to gain at the beginning. And that's what you have to think of. Once you start going above a certain amount of money, you need to make sure operationally you're correct with those things that I've showed you, like accounts, like your trustee situation. All of those things need to be put into place correctly in order for you to then access or be better considered for those funding opportunities that are out there. So thank you very much. I hope that explains a bit. And if there's any questions, please let me know.
Thanks so much, Kofi. That was great. Really, really insightful. Lots of information to digest there. Look, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I think you've been quite comprehensive, Kofi, so lots of positive feedback. So I'll start with that, if that's okay. There's a few things here. So the presentation was excellent. As a CIC director, I've tried to access funding and face rejection after rejection, despite having great plans which will impact young people positively. It's great to hear how to navigate his system, this system. Thanks so much for being so transparent and sharing your experience. So it's a really, really great news. Amanda, yeah, was saying fascinating. Esther was saying great, thank you so much, really insightful. So if anyone does have any last minute questions, please feel free to stick them in the chat. But Kofi, I think you had covered everything, just really positive. Maybe Kofi, the only thing I thought about is any signposting, obviously signpost to your organisation, but anyone that, you know, these volunteer organisations,
Yeah,
around finance.
yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. And yes, our next stage for Urban MBAs, we are looking for a property to create the school of the future around the 9 transformative technologies that I speak about. There is going to be a massive gap with in terms of upskilling. And while we have sort of like 100 million for mental health charities at the moment, because that's the big buzz, what we will find is that in the next 3 to 5 years, there is going to be a raft of funding out for upskilling people to learn about things like AI, et cetera, et cetera. We obviously have to navigate this whole area because we have young people who are applying for funding and also setting up organizations. So we keep a close eye on all of this. And that's why even the global area. But things like autonomous cars are coming in, quantum computers. You see the government last year said 2.5 billion is being put aside for shortage for supercomputers and quantum computers. These things are, and the main thing that you've got to remember about this is not to get blinded by all the science of the technologies, is how can your organization help solve those problems that inevitably we're going to face when lots of those smaller jobs have gone, because retail is a prime example of this, where people who would have been getting funding, using retail jobs while they're going to university in order to sustain themselves, and will no longer have the opportunity as these stores become autonomous, like Amazon, Go, and Fresh. So what they're all doing now is becoming delivery drivers. But I know also for certain that they're already using drones and other types of things to deliver food to people's homes. And Co-op have a robot that drives along the ground in Milton Keynes that will send it to you. So you've got to think about what the problems are going to be coming ahead of schedule so that you can best serve these areas, and how do you work on these impacts. So when the shift starts happening, these are the grants that will be coming out, and it's worthwhile knowing what you should be looking for.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Kofi. There is a couple of things that have come through just now. So how do we, organisations, move forward from here and keep connected with regards to the flow of information and knowing where the funding is, what is being put in place to increase VCs 1% for Black businesses?
So I'll stop sharing my screens, and the simple answer to your question is that I recently spoke to a council member from Islington about this, and I feel that first and foremost, as a Black community, we also have very rich billionaires and millionaires in there as well. Why is it that we cannot get together for them to create VC funding that will allow and when I talked lived experience earlier on, these guys understand the problems. So when they create VC funding opportunities, that's the best way to do it. And I think that what we've got to do is also rally our community. If we look at the history of finance and funding, I don't think this area is going to change. And I sort of made a comment earlier on that, is it necessarily true? I said it's deliberate, because I think a lot of these people know this. There's one report saying VC funders are not aware. There's another one from Morgan Stanley saying that that distribution is out there, and these people are also not aware. But it's not the truth, because they're the ones investing the money and they know who it's coming to. So you can't tell me you don't know. I think so. What we've got to do is we've got to create that system, and I think other communities have done that better than the Black community. So long-winded way of answering your question, because I tell stories with everything, so apologies. But I think that we need to look at that. When you ask the VC community about how much money is distributed to marginalized community groups, they run a mile. So they're deliberately not giving you that information. We need to do that. In terms of what you are saying is knowing where the funding is, etc. That's why I say find an organization that does funding bids, etc. I use a company called EduKit, if that's of any use to any of you. And I remember speaking to, and she's a Black founder, by the way, her name is Natalie. And I remember speaking to her and I said, you know what, I'm having real problems. She looked at our outcomes and results. She said, Kof, if I cannot get you funding, right, I will pack in. And I told you that we've just had some of our biggest amounts of funding we've ever had, because what I've seen with them and the way they work is they bring up grants that I've never ever heard of. And I'm like, where did you get that from? And all of that. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that you need to look at trusts as well. There are lots of trusts that are giving out funding. They are actually better because they're unknown, right? So you have the typical funding areas like Unlimited and all the lottery, all the usual suspects. And that is the one that 90% of people are always applying for. But there are trusts, trusts are things like the Paul Hamlin Foundation, which are quite well known also, Henry Smith. There are so many of those that I was unaware of, and I've actually learned so much from this organization, Finding Us Funds. And then we deliberately targeted funding for Black organizations, knowing that we had a higher opportunity of getting the funding than if we went for all of those around the corner. And then the other thing is you can now see that the lottery and all of those people are looking for Black organizations that are doing well that can also distribute this. So that's also a good thing that's happened in the last 18-24 months.
Brill, thank you so much, Kofi. I hope that answers your question, Ken. So I think that's it for questions at the moment, Kofi. Yeah, everyone's saying thank you. It was a really insightful session. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time as well. And thanks, everyone. I'll hand over to Juliet, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Massive thank you, Kofi. That was just incredible. And I can't believe how much you packed in. And it's like, whoa. And so much I have learned. I mean, I feel a bit stupid now, but I'd never thought about how our education system is so memory-based and how, of course, that doesn't suit everybody. So just amazing what you're doing. And likewise, I was shocked to hear that, only 1% of VC funding goes to minority communities. I mean, that's absolutely awful. Yeah. But I think it's, the point you made about knowing your worth and applying for more is, top tips. So thank you so much for sharing your insight. I really appreciate it. And we're going to share your presentation far and wide so that as many people as possible can learn from what you've said today. So thank you. Okay, so we won't be having the first Thursday in July because of convention clash. So join us again, fundraisers, on Thursday the 3rd of August for our next networking event. And in the meantime, as I say, enjoy the good weather. It's not so good here today, but hopefully we'll be the next couple of months. So take care and see you soon. And thanks again, Kofi. Bye.